Hey everyone, Anarch here. So today I'm going to be addressing a subject which I'm asked about all the time in DMs and comments to my videos, and that is how to build and grow organizations. I think this is a really natural question for people to ask. My videos always have call to actions. I try to focus around methods for good organization. I propose particular revolutionary concepts and approaches. So I understand why the people who follow my work would be interested in my answers to these questions. One thing that has to be said, of course, is that this subject is probably way too big for me to ever really cover in one piece. I think it's probably too big for anybody to ever cover in one piece. So everything that I'm going to say in this video, I want you to take it with a grain of salt, recognizing that your context is going to make a big difference, that there's no way to actually create one truly overarching model for how to organize correctly. There's always going to be a bunch of different approaches. It's more like a toolkit than it is a linear path from point A, B, C, D, and so on. So that being said, in this video series that I am currently working on, A Modern Anarchism, part 4 actually will have my best attempt at sort of creating a flowchart of if your conditions are X, then do Y sort of thing. Given that I have so much room to do so, that piece will probably be much more comprehensive than just this little video right here. But hopefully this video does serve to give you some ideas on how to proceed forward. One thing as preface to this short little conversation, one thing that I've noticed is that our movements don't really have the I guess what you might call institutional memory if it were government. We don't really have the movement memory that many eras of the movement had in the past. If you were an organizer in the early 1900s, you sort of had some familiarity about how to approach your problems because you knew other people who had approached these precise problems before, maybe even people you were close to. The unions that existed in the workplaces that you were part of or that your parents or your extended family were part of had probably been organized by people that you knew and who they knew. So there were always these sources for advice. I think the current generation is really set apart, or rather the current generations are set apart from this because we don't have that movement memory because like the entire boomer generation just dropped out of the process. They did not carry forth the flag. And so we're in a position now where we're really starting from square one in a significant way. One thing that I want to help people understand is, they always seem to have this concept that we're in like 1917 or even like 1911 or something. For those that are familiar, I'm just saying those were very revolutionary years, right? The early 19 teens had a huge amount of revolutionary activity taking place. And what will happen is that people will often look at those as models for how to struggle. But I think this is misunderstanding our place in history. We're not in 1917. We're not even in the 1890s. Or the late 1800s, which is to say we're not even in the time of Marx and Bakunin and all of them. I think instead we're in a new formational period. We're in the time of Fourier and Saint-Simon and so on. What that means is that we have to chart the territory once again. We have to create the maps. We have to develop the methods which will apply to this era. And the big reason for that is that conditions have just changed so enormously much from the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Things were very, very different. We have many different tools that are available. We are coming up against challenges, which in many ways look very unlike those challenges that they were facing within that period of time. And so that means we have to not start completely from scratch. We need to learn from the lessons of history, but we need to recognize that it is up to us now to discover what the methods will look like for this era, to write the theory for this era, to understand the struggle that we are now part of, to find the conflicts which are inherent within the structures of society, and determine what it looks like to provide resolution to those. So, that being said, I think we can kind of understand there being broadly, and this is a huge reduction or a huge simplification, there can be kind of understood to be like broadly 3 categories of revolutionary action. And I'll just say they are the statist methods, which is to say where you organize within the state or within existing hierarchical structures, and then you try to turn them, you try to steer them in a revolutionary direction. There is the sort of insurrection model, which I would say had its earliest inklings in like the propaganda of the deed, these sort of early acts of assassinating extremely powerful leaders and things like that. And it sort of evolved into the modern era as the insurrectionary method, which is a much more sophisticated method, I will say. And also is somewhat present in, for example, protest movements and things such as that. And the last is the one I advocate, which is what you might call the prefigurative or dual power strategy. So this strategy is more about building a new power structure. It's not about either trying to steer the existing power structures, nor is it just a purely deconstructive or destructive mode. It is a constructive mode. It is about building something else. And you might see some inklings of this all throughout anarchist theory and history and practice, and libertarian socialist theory more broadly. You know, the IWW's theme of building the new in the shell of the old, for example. You know, you are building the version of the future, the most maximal form of the future that you can within the present. Now, obviously, you cannot build it completely. It's not possible to, just build a fully decommodified society in the current world. That's just not possible. There's not room for it. The world would suffocate it to death even if we could construct it. So instead, what we have to do is we have to build it maximally as similar to that one as possible. So this brings us back to the anarchist concept of means-ends unity, which I've talked about pretty extensively in part 1 of A Modern Anarchism. But it is really present in all my work because I write anarchist theory, and you'll find it throughout anarchist theory. The idea is that you cannot achieve ends through means which are entirely contradictory to those ends. So what that means in this example is you can't take a hierarchical society, a hierarchical power structure, and turn it into a tool to create a horizontal power structure, a power structure which we control. By the very fact that we used the enemy system, we are only going to strengthen and perpetuate the enemy system. So this is to say, we are rejecting the statist method, and we cannot be narrowly deconstructive either, because we don't want to only build a deconstructive future. We don't want a future that is based entirely around critique. And so this is why the insurrectionary or spontaneous means of direct deconstruction of society, that can't work by itself either. If we want to actually succeed, we have to have both a constructive and destructive program. We have to get rid of the old structures. We have to weaken the old structures while strengthening the new structures. So maybe now you kind of at least have a basis for what I mean when I say prefiguration. We are prefiguring the future society in a way. And as I said, we can't construct it completely identical. That's not possible. It just won't function. It would have to be autarkic, as they say. That is to say, it would have to have no contact outside of itself. And this is literally what the utopian socialists tried to do back in the day. So, you can't just, disappear off into the wilderness and build yourself a little commune all by yourself. You might succeed in building your little commune, but your commune will never become powerful. It will certainly never become a threat to the existing structure. You'll notice they don't care if you go build a little commune off in the woods, because a commune off in the woods doesn't have any possibility of deconstructing the society, the hierarchical society that we are oppressed by. So they'll allow you to do that. What we have to do is we have to construct these bodies as a counter power. It has to be something we build as a body of conflict with the existing society. So that requires a large amount of work. Let me say, this is not just thought up out of whole cloth. This is influenced by both inspection of conditions and looking at history. So if what we are doing is looking at the only example of a revolution that we have, which is the bourgeois revolutions of the past, what we will see is that the bourgeois revolutions, the revolutions that gave us modern liberal democracy and capitalism as it stands, did not just spontaneously pop up out of nowhere, impose their will through violent force, and get precisely what they wanted. There are some people who tried to tell the story in that way. Even on the left, some people tried to tell the story in that way, but that is not in fact what took place. This process, which eventually led to the capitalism we see today, began a long time ago in the Italian city-states, in what were called the Borgs, which, evolved into the word burg, which we now recognize as being on the end of many city names like Pittsburgh and so on. It's also the root of the word bourgeois. And this is where these relations, which eventually became capitalist relations, began. But here's the thing. It did not start as its fully modern form of capitalism. It was a sort of proto-capitalism. What they did is they were creating the beginnings of the profit motive. They were the beginnings of the merchant class. And it was existing alongside a feudal society where the lords both existed apart and as part of this merchant class. So at that point, it did not have power, right? This force of capitalism, which is now pervades absolutely everything, was just an emergent dynamic within the feudal order. And it existed alongside it and, to some degree, counter to it. Because many of these free cities, as Kropotkin tells us in The State, Its Historic Role, were actually kind of a thorn in the side of power accumulators. There would be a lot of occasions where these cities were trying to be taken in by some larger imperialist structure, and they would resist this process. Instead, they would maintain their autonomy. And through maintaining their autonomy, they allowed these capitalist relations to continue brewing inside of the burgs. This didn't only take place in Italy. I'll note, of course, it took place in a bunch of other places as well. But here's the thing. This is not a story I'm telling you so that you will think capitalism is good or something, this is in no way apologia for capitalism. But what I'm hoping you're getting out of this is that those revolutions, those bourgeois revolutions we recognize as like the French Revolution and the American Revolution and so on, those were outcomes long after a process of capitalist prefiguration had already taken place. They had already built up a replacement economic base, which gave power to this new class of people. The new class of people had become powerful already through the construction of that new kind of power structure. And under the conditions that they were being assailed or attempted to be absorbed into one of these systems, they had to maintain their autonomy against that desire of these larger systems to absorb them. Great. So there is a very long preface. That is what we have to do with a horizontal society. We have to do that in these conditions in creating an emancipatory, a liberatory society. We have to create council structures. We have to imbue direct democracy into a bunch of different places where it does not currently exist. And I know direct democracy, it's this bugbear among the anarchists and on the left broadly. For those of you who are gritting their teeth right now, just understand, these videos are primers. Okay, calm down. So here's the thing. What we need to be doing is creating this counterpower which empowers the people. If our goal is to create a society wherein the people are in control of their own future, we need to begin putting the people in control of their own future now. Okay? There's no delaying. We can't use the enemy structure, right? The capitalists didn't become capitalists by, trying, just getting into the feudal state and trying to recreate another feudal state that was just pro-capitalism. Eventually mercantilism did come about, which is kind of like that, but it did not come about until they had the power to be an actual threat and also an asset to that existing power structure, in which case they were able to merge, but that was only under the conditions they had very similar structures. We're trying to build something that dissolves those existing structures over time, that replaces them, not just becomes a new part of this apparatus like capitalism did. So what does that mean for us? That means we need to begin creating organizations that are horizontal, which model the behaviors that we want to see in a future society, where we make decisions together through consensus and agreement rather than hierarchy, rather than electing some representative within our organization to do all the work. Our organizations have to model those counterpowers. So what that means is that organization is extremely important. We need to have structures which will mimic those, and therefore we will need to begin creating structures. Okay? So this is why I'm an organizationalist. I don't think that you can really carry out this revolutionary process unless you begin building coherent structures. So, what kind of things might these structures do to carry out this revolutionary practice? Well, first of all, as we've said, they have to themselves be directly democratic bodies. They have to themselves be horizontal bodies. But they should also attempt to weave their way into all of the other facets of a functioning society. So I talk about this in my video, Constructing the Revolution, which I should have plugged a long time ago. I'm sure I'll put it up here in the link, and pay attention for it, and you can go watch that video. It's a much more in-depth description of what I'm talking about here. But I say in that video that there are 4 pillars to this process. If you want to build these structures properly in such a way, they will be able to perpetuate on a broader scale. You need councils, which is that democratic aspect I've just discussed, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. You need economics, which can be represented in a variety of ways: cooperatives, mutual aid programs, direct distribution like free stores and so on. You also need defense, which can be represented in a variety of different things. That could be militias, community defense organizations, de-escalation trainings. It could be harm reduction, all kinds of different things. Creating medic crews, I think, really could be considered defense. And lastly is intelligence. So intelligence is just us gathering intelligence. It is us monitoring the enemy. It is us embedding in enemy structures. Not in order to, we'd already discussed earlier, we're not trying to get into them to steer them. We're trying to gather intel. We're trying to embed spies. We're trying to make sure that we are present and know what our enemy is doing. So we always want to be gathering intel on the enemy. We also always want to be trying to publish damning facts about the enemy into public spaces. You can see some examples of this in things like WikiLeaks or Antifa and so on. So these are examples of intelligence. So these are the 4 pillars: councils, defense, economics, intelligence. Okay? So what we have to do is figure out what it looks like to build horizontal structures in each of those 4 categories. So we discussed how our organizations, which fits into the council pillar, need to be horizontal, but we also need to be doing things like creating neighborhood councils or block committees. When we create another program, it should come along with a council structure. So I'll give an example. In Cooperation Tulsa, we constructed a garden with Church of the Restoration, which is on Greenwood, which some people might be familiar with as the site of like historic Black Wall Street. And we created a community garden there. But when we did so, we also made sure that it was democratized. Not that there was any pushback. They were very cooperative with that. But you want to make sure that each of these projects are democratized. Be sure that you're not just creating a project, because it can be co-opted much more easily if there is no mechanism for horizontal control. So that might be an example of, say, economics. And in a way, it has a little bit of a component of defense, because you're feeding people, you're keeping them safe by keeping them away from food insecurity, right? So after you have begun creating these different kinds of programs and democratizing each of them, then what you want to make sure that you are doing is binding them all together as well. So in history, this has been called confederation or federation, okay? This is to say, you want to make sure that each of these is bound together into a bigger body where they can all cooperate. So using our situation here in Tulsa, once again, we have something called the Redbud Aid Distribution Network. And RAD functions as a container for both Cooperation Tulsa and Scissortail Anarchist Organization. And people from both organizations participate in RAD and coordinate and make decisions together. RAD is also a way for us to include neighbors in our projects. So what that means is RAD is functioning as a federation or a confederation. You might hear either of these terms used. This is a very important component. You want to make sure that all of these bodies you're creating are not separate, because then they might end up competing at some point. You don't want them to have to compete. You want them to be able to cooperate, because cooperation is what makes our structure strong. Our structure needs to be a cooperative structure because we are trying to create a cooperative society. So the Confederation is a mechanism to bind together all of the projects that you're involved with. And you want to make those confederations about the size of pertinent decisions. So for example, we would probably not want to begin folding in organizations outside of Tulsa or the surrounding areas into Redbud. Instead, what we would want to see happen is a new federation being born, and then we build another bigger one that joins those two federations together. Okay, and you just keep doing this. As you get larger and larger numbers of cooperating structures, you bind them into larger and larger federations of cooperating pieces, each of them providing the components of a counterpower. You do this long enough, you begin creating quite a power structure. Let me tell you, even just here in Tulsa, we are beginning to develop a pretty significant power structure binding all of these groups together. We have now established a community center. We have 2.5 acres of land where we are now creating a composting cooperative. We have a film collective. The space hosts free dinners every Friday. In fact, right after I record this video, I'll be going to one of them. It's a community space where we host our meetings. It is a tool library. It's so many things. And we have begun developing this power because every time we built something out, we made sure it was all joined into the structure. So we're only 2 years in, and we've already achieved this. And there's nothing about this which cannot be emulated elsewhere. You can emulate this method elsewhere. So I'm coming around to the end of my long rambling time here, and I think I've done a pretty good job of covering the subject. I'd like to mention some last little things, kind of pertinent to discussions that I've been having with people recently. Even though all this stuff may sound very exciting to you, or at least I hope it does, I want to encourage you to not spend too much time ideating before you create an organizational structure. So I've been talking to several people who have reached out for advice. And in the process of me giving them advice, I found out they had not created a charter yet. They had not formalized a decision-making process. There was kind of some variation on whether this was causing conflict or not. But in my experience, this is a bad way to go. What you will find is that there will be conflict which arises because there is a difference in expectations. So this difference in expectations will lead to disagreements and unnecessary conflict, which could have been totally avoided if you had both just had some sort of charter or organizational agreement you could point to and be like, hey, we kind of, we already agreed we were going to resolve our disputes in this way. Maybe we should just resort to the structure and see how it works. It also allows you to iterate over and over and over and improve that structure to meet your needs. Because it's built in a directly democratic fashion, you can always change the structure. So don't be afraid of agreeing to the structure because it is an adaptive thing. So what I would really encourage you to do is as soon as you have 2 people that are interested in some project you want to carry out, create an organizational charter, and I'm going to link those down in the description here. I'm going to link the organizational charters that are currently being used for Cooperation Tulsa and Scissortail Anarchist Organization. In fact, I'll probably even put the one for Redbud Aid Distribution down in there. And I want to invite you all to just take those organizational charters and to use them. Use them as you please. Change the contents, change the names, however you like, and then pass them and use them. Okay, I've been passing these out, giving these to people for at least the last few days a lot. I've got a lot of people who are interested in these charters when I offered them. So I'd like to make them available to you all as well. And I just really want to recommend, ideation is not bad, but be sure that you get this structure in place. Create something solid for yourselves. And then look for a project that is within your reach. Don't think bigger than you can achieve in the immediate moment. I mean, I'm not going to tell you how to imagine and to think things out. And I hope that your creativity will take you all kinds of different places. But I want to recommend start with projects you can achieve. Okay? So I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples before we end here. Maybe a reading group. Literally one person can run a reading group. Just be consistent. Get that reading group going and then do it once a week or once every other week or once a month or something. But just get it started. Create the social media, pass the charter, agree, and then begin using the charter as appropriate. Anyway, I just want to encourage you all, if you've listened this long, hopefully you're interested, please go to my Patreon and become a patron. It helps me an enormous amount. Now it's during the summer and I'm a contract worker to make the majority of my income, and it's just all dried up. So, you guys giving me help here through the Patreon makes an enormous, enormous difference. I really need it right now, in fact. So obviously I'm going to link that in the description, and I invite you to go over there and become a patron. But I think that's all for today. Hopefully you all enjoyed this little segment, just me rambling on a topic once again. I'm going to keep trying to make these pretty regularly. It's been pretty easy to develop a list, and I'll see you next time.